And the conversation sits between two pillars. There's shared values and then there's shared outcomes. The conversation is how we bridge the gap between our shared values and our shared outcomes, right? What is it that we believe, understanding at a deep level why we believe what we believe, and then ultimately what that should lead to from an outcome standpoint, if we're talking culturally or we're talking politically. And the conversation is what happens in the middle that bridges the gap between those two things.
I would say take it to the lowest common denominator, right? Like if you're having a disagreement with somebody, it's find a place to agree first.
Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey Kight. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post 9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 122 features Dan Hollaway, an Army veteran and the host of Drinkin Bros and Citizen podcast. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time.
All right. Good afternoon from the great state of Ohio. For me, the great state of Texas, Dan Hollaway. Welcome to Veteran Made.
How's it going?
Doing well, brother. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate your time.
Sure, yeah. Yeah. It's fucking Wait, can I swear on this show? I don't even know what's going on here.
Say whatever the fuck you want.
There we go.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, pretty much everybody in the audience knows who you are, which is great. So I want to jump right in. On that note, I mean, one of the cool things I think, and I want to dive into it with you, is anytime I share any of your content, you know, some people love it, some people hate it, but everybody kind of responds to it. And I don't mean that in some sort of like controversial headline grabbing way, but I think it gets at one of the things that our community can do well, not everybody in it, but a lot of us do well, is critical thinking and critical thought and the ability to hear and engage with multiple different perspectives, which I think is something that, like I said, some of us do well and some of us don't. And so that's kind of where I want to start the conversation and really chat about, you know, the way that you look at first principles and thinking and operating in the world from that perspective, you know, rather than just living in the moment and kind of reacting and responding current events, cultural issues, like whatever it might be. So can you give us just a primer on how you apply first principles and what your belief system and operating system is from that point?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, it can be difficult for, I guess, let me do a problem statement first. So most folks want something and they want it now, right? That's typically not how life works. Those of us who have been in the military, which is, I would assume, the vast majority of your audience, know that time and preparation are what create results, right? So first, I would temper my expectations in that regard, and then second, first principles are. It's not just the Constitution. It's not just, if you're religious, the Ten Commandments or whatever. It's not just a bulleted list of facts, right? Or beliefs. There's a whole infrastructure that supports this stuff. Like, it's not enough to understand. It's not enough to know that we have a Constitution. It's not enough to know what's in it. It's important to know like the 1,000 years or so it took to get there. And we're talking about, you know, years and years and years of trial and error, I guess. You might go from I would say start in the Middle Ages is a pretty good place. Although if you're gonna research history, I would go all the way back to Greece and stuff like that. But if you're trying to understand the current West that we live in today, go to the Middle Ages and move forward from there, and you'll understand things like why are property rights, for example, so important, right? Because that was something that was both exclusionary in the past and also used as a second tier exclusion. So even here in the United States, only landowners were able to vote in the beginning, right? So you don't necessarily have to, this is a good way to put this. You don't necessarily have to stop people from voting or even change the way they might vote. If you're trying to win power, all you would have to do is appeal only to one group, which is to say landowners, right? Anybody that tried to threaten that would be threatening a de facto aristocracy, and people would rebel. So you have to understand things like, let's go back to the Magna Carta, right? I'm going to choose a couple of points throughout history that are really that really matter. The Magna Carta, France invades. King John needs the northern barons to join with the English army to fight them off, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, well, no, we're not going to do that because you're being a kind of a cunt right now. And he's like, well, here's what we'll do. We'll write this Charter of Rights, and I'll sign it, and you guys agree to do whatever. Now, he eventually reneged on that promise, obviously, but the Magna Carta was one of the first times that pen was put to paper to articulate the rights of people that weren't in charge, right? Or at least in some way delimit the power of the monarch, the king, or whatever it happened to be. Now, it only applied to the barons, right? The common folk still had no real rights. So you fast forward maybe 100 years or so, and you get to the plague and all this stuff is coming through. Things are kind of tough, and more weight goes on to the general population. And then we get to the early part of the 16th century, 1525, and you see the serf rebellion, right? Which is, serfdom was quite a bit different than slavery. A serf was tied to the land and not to the owner necessarily, but you were a slave to the land essentially for your whole life, and so were your children. The serf rebellion happens in 1525, dust up, and then about 120 years later or so, you get this document called an Agreement of the People. It was written by this group called the Levelers, like a level that you would use to do construction or whatever. But they write this agreement that, for the first time in human history, articulates the rights of common people, right? Not that's where that prince and pauper thing comes from in a lot of government bureaucracy that you see. But for the first time in human history, they articulate the rights of people. And then after that document comes out, you start to see people like Montesquieu write about individual rights and separation of powers. You see John Locke talk about property rights, and that the ultimate property right is your body, your person, right? And you should have complete control over it no matter what. And an agreement of the people, and then some of this other writing, Locke, Montesquieu, so on, led to this textbook called the Preceptor that was the basis for the U.S. Constitution. It is what all the founding fathers would have read when they went to university about government. It's basically a history and treatise on Western civilization. And then, of course, there's other stuff that pops up, the French Revolution and Renaissance and stuff like that. But and then we have our own Constitution. So when you talk about it's not enough to say, well, I'm a constitutionalist. Like, okay, cool. What does that mean? I don't expect anybody to memorize every word of the Constitution, but there are points in there. The first one would be that this was all built on something, and if you don't understand history, the history of it, you can't fully absorb why it matters. And I say that because we have this tendency to unsolve problems that have been solved already. There's different articulations of that. the fourth turning suggests we're on some kind of 80-year cycle. There's others. I think we're on a more protracted, like 200-year cycle. But yeah, if you don't understand all this stuff, you can't have a good argument. And look, the purpose for having these beliefs is twofold. One, it's because they're right, and having those beliefs and espousing them and living them makes you better and makes the country better, right? But the other part is to convince people who are skeptical about it or who have differing opinions that this is indeed the right way. And if you can't make that argument and you don't have the underlying infrastructure to make the argument, then you're going to fail at that second task, which I think coalition building is a really important thing as well. So, right now, the Republicans just won a big election, swept all, both chambers of the Congress and what won the presidency. And after all of the abuse, it could be very easy to dance on the graves of your enemies, right? But these people are not your enemies. They're your American citizens, right? And even if they were your enemy, Lincoln liked to say that if I've made my enemy my friend, have I not defeated him, right? So without the best weapon in your tool belt is knowledge, right? And if you can calmly explain it to people, like, it's not enough to say that I'm a Second Amendment absolutist. That is a platitude unless you understand why it matters, unless you understand property rights and that you should have the unabated right to defend your property, to include your person anywhere you go with any weapon that you deem fit, right? That's why it matters. It's not just, you can't just yell, shall not infringe into the ether and expect people to take you seriously or come to your side, right? So first principles to me isn't just about having a list of things I believe in, right? It's about having a deep understanding of history and why this stuff matters. That's a long answer to a short question, but there it is.
No, it's great. And you're taking it exactly where I want to go. You just said, kind of two different things, or you said two things within that are important that I want to unpack. One is the idea of trial and error. You can't try things and make mistakes from a shaky foundation, right? And then the other is espousing beliefs and then also living beliefs. So as you've built the platforms that you have these conversations on, one thing I think you do especially well is evaluate all of those different things through conversations, both with people that you agree with and people that you don't agree with. So two questions. One, dig a little deeper. What is the value of having that historical perspective? And then two, how can we be better at understanding there are problems that have been solved, but we also have a lack of historical context and knowledge today with all of the progress that we have made? And so what's the ping pong back and forth? I mean, specifically with you and the conversations you have and the platforms you've built, but then also just what you're seeing in culture at large.
Well, here's one thing, and I learned this a long time ago, but I heard Michael Schellenberger say it. He actually said it on my show a couple of times. If you're not familiar with him, he's from the Twitter files and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you can find out who he is. Writes very good books. He likes to say that when I'm writing about these issues, I tend to try to leave out the names of politicians because really smart people, when you say words like Trump or Biden, get really stupid very quickly, right? So the other thing I'll say to preface this is that there is, just because you don't like somebody's solution to a problem doesn't mean a problem doesn't exist, right? So I think it's very obvious what our differences are. It's far more compelling to me what our similarities are, right? So and here's a good example of that. The most common switch politically isn't from center right to center left or vice versa. It's from populist progressive to populist libertarian or vice versa, right? And that should tell you something. It's that we're not aligned based on political parties or this antiquated idea of conservatism versus classical liberalism. That those things don't really, I mean, they certainly exist still, but that's not what defines our parties anymore. What define our parties now, and this is just a case of, political evolution, but what defines the parties now are, in my opinion, what always defines the parties. We just get the wool pulled over our eyes for some amount of time. And it's that it is the aristocracy versus the rest of us, right? Now, the US did their best to prevent an aristocracy from happening. But by the late part of the 19th century, it was in full force, right? So it took about 100 years to completely change that situation. So when I'm talking to somebody who has, on the surface, you would think there's no way I'm going to agree with anything this person says. Well, the fact is that we're all human beings, and you could just take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and see exactly where you're going to agree with these people. They want affordable food and shelter and energy first, right? And the safety that comes along with those things. Those are existential threats to just survival. Those are the first things that people want. And regardless of how crazy and literal Hitler this fucking election was, people looked in their bank accounts, they looked at their mortgages, and they looked at their grocery bills and said, you know what, fuck that, right? So if you need any more evidence, there it is. You have far more in common with these people than you think. You have to have the temerity to brush aside the differences for a moment, connect with somebody on the things that you agree with, and then say, now please explain to me why you think this way about this issue that we disagree with, and do it at a granular level. There's a psychological principle, or a psychotherapy principle, that if two people are at an impasse, and this is typically for married couples, but if two people are at an impasse, the therapist's job is to force one person to explain the other's position back to them in a way that's acceptable to them. For example, you believe X and I believe Y. I have to explain to you why you believe X, and you have to agree with my explanation of it. Because until we do that, we're not actually agreed. There's no epistemology. We're not actually agreeing on all the facts, right? So once I have a true understanding and not, so what you're saying is followed by the worst possible interpretation, right? It's called the principle of charity. It's like a first century Jewish historian came up with this stuff. But once we've established the actual terms, what we're going to find is there's quite a few less layers to peel back before we find agreement, right? Like we all want to be safe. We all want, like, this idea of censorship is because people on the left have been propagandized so much. And this happens not just in America, all throughout human history. This has happened. People get propagandized so much and told that words are literal violence, right? They're told that people disagreeing with you or thinking your lifestyle is not cool or whatever the fuck, it means that at some point they're going to take that next step and come physically assault you. That's the message that you get from these assholes. Well, it's not true, right? I mean, it's never really true. People are living their lives. They got shit to do. They don't have time to even think about you. They see it in passing. They're like, oh, that's stupid. And they move on with their day. Like, that's it. It's like one, you've got to be resilient. And two, that's not a real threat. But they're told it's a threat, right? So how do you respond to that? Well, we've got to stop that. We have to stop that thing. Okay, cool. So now your job is to, is to explain, one, why that's stupid and it's not a real threat. And why people should be, more resilient and blah, blah, blah. But also address the fact that they've been propagandized. Like you're listening to the media repeat back to you what you think I think. Why don't you listen to me tell you what I think, right? But none of this stuff happens unless you've got the balls to actually have that conversation.
I mean, at the political level, we have politicians that are brokering that conversation, right? In quotes. At the cultural level, though, we have to be able to have that conversation with ourselves and with each other, right? So, like, if there's 80 to 90% of the things that we agree on, and then 10 to 20% of the things that we disagree on, culturally, and then upstream from that politically, how do you think that we need to be doing that kind of at our level, culturally, citizen to citizen, right? And you do this through your podcast as you have these conversations. The ones you had with Jank, I think, are a great example of this. But part of what was missing from those conversations, and I think what's missing from the conversation at large, is actually getting to that point where we got to stop retreading all of these. Hey, we agree on these things and we disagree on these things. So let's focus on these things, because we all have the biases to go back to defend the beliefs that we have rather than the ones that we share. So, like, how do we move that conversation forward, person to person, citizen to citizen?
Well, first you've got to talk to people, right? there's no like this shit. This doesn't happen magically. You know what I mean? And you're not using third party cutouts to have the conversation either. Like this stuff happens at the dinner table. It happens with how you. I mean, and look, now we've got these obviously these social media platforms where 60% of all of our communication is happening, which is odd, right? Because 95+% of communication is nonverbal, and we're communicating almost primarily now on a platform that doesn't allow for that, which is fucking us up. Like our inclination now is to intentionally misinterpret people as a defense mechanism. It just makes this psychological concept of othering people so much easier. Right. Like I can, you say something, you're an archetype to me. You're not a person anymore. You know what I mean? You're what do they call it? Extreme MAGA Republican or something. Extremist MAGA Republican is one of the phrases they use. Right. Or somebody might say libtard or whatever the fuck. That's an archetype. That's like, that's just classification, which is something that we do with our lower mammalian brain. That's not an upper mammalian brain feature. We classify, look, it's pattern recognition. It's to protect us from threats or show us benefits. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with it, but you do have an upper mammalian brain where you can look at somebody as a human being, as an individual, right? And the first place it starts is with your physical and digital neighbors, the people that you talk to on a routine basis. If you're scrolling through, first of all, know your neighbors. That's just a good security measure, to be frank, right? Like if shit hits the fan, I got to know who I can rely on in my neighborhood to either, or who I'm going to have to push down onto the ground out of my way so I can get to work. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That's just something that you should be doing to protect your family. But in the digital footprint as well, it's like, come on, man. You gotta. What exactly is your goal? I guess I would ask people: is it to own liberal people or conservative people? Because that's not really a goal? You know what I mean? You're just kind of a cunt at that point. Are you trying to convince people of something? Well, that's not the great way to go about it. Obviously, if you're trying to convince somebody, yelling at them that they're stupid is not the way to go about it. And I think, more than just the conversation is the result of it, right? It's a familiarity. There's an old phrase, it's hard to hate up close, right? For most people, the closer you are to somebody, and I don't mean like sociologically, I mean physically, the more physically close you are to people, the more likely it is that you're going to find some common ground. We've known this forever, right? Like people in the 1960s who had different political opinions hung out. And we, in 2024, like, man, I can't imagine how they even did that. It's like they didn't fucking care. That's how, right? It didn't dominate their lives all the time. It's like being a football fan. Like maybe you're a fan of the Browns. I hope not, because it sucks. No, but
I'm not. I'm a college guy. I'm an Ohio State guy. I'm not really an NFL
guy. Okay. So I'm a Penn State guy.
Yeah.
So I went to Penn State. I went to Penn State. I like their football team. You like Ohio State. We're both still football fans, right? So it's like we in the majority we agree, in the minority we disagree. And I think it's a lot of fun. Like nobody wants to be the same as everybody else. That's weird. It's a lot of fun to converse about the differences, talk a little shit maybe, yeah. Right? I like that stuff. I think it's beneficial because you know who everybody is. But you have to do it. You have to actually talk to people in a way that they're going to listen. One, don't just don't just listen waiting for your turn to speak. Actually listen to what the person's saying and ask them questions. And when you ask them questions, don't make assumptions. Somebody tells you, well, I think the United States should have free healthcare. Nothing's free, obviously, but they're going to say that, right? I think we should have free healthcare. Well, if you say, so what you're saying is socialism and redistribution of wealth. Why? What have you accomplished by saying that? Instead, maybe ask them why they think, other people should be forced to pay for something for them. I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And generally listen to their answer. Like, well, I think it's best for humanity if people do this, this, and this. I'm like, all right, cool. Do you think it's okay? Well, I mean, what if the majority of people agree that something you disagree with is best for humanity? You're just going to play along with that? And it leads to a deeper conversation about what it means to be a human being, where rights come from, and what exactly they encompass, and what system of government we're in. Because people keep using this phrase, our democracy. That's not a thing, right? We're a constitutional republic. There's only been one direct democracy in the history of the world, and it was in Athens, and it lasted about 2 years before they shut that shit down 2,000 years ago. Because it was an absolute fucking mess.
We're back in after a little bit of technical difficulties. No worries there. I mean, the last thing you were talking about, which I think is important, is jumping into that conversation, right? And the conversation sits between two pillars. You talked about it about the 60s, and weirdly enough, the Big Ten football is a good example, right? There's shared values, and then there's shared outcomes. The conversation is how we bridge the gap between our shared values and our shared outcomes, right? What is it that we believe, understanding at a deep level why we believe what we believe, and then ultimately what that should lead to from an outcome standpoint, if we're talking culturally or we're talking politically. And the conversation is what happens in the middle that bridges the gap between those two things. And if you're not having that conversation in good faith with shared values and you're not chasing shared outcomes, well, then you're fucked, right? And I think that's kind of the meat of what you're talking about.
I would say take it to the lowest common denominator, right? Like if you're having a disagreement with somebody, it's find a place to agree first. So one of the touchier subjects you're going to run into is the Second Amendment. So there's two parts of this. One, what the average person wants, like the government wants to disarm you so they can dominate your ass. There's no question about that. But the average person, what they want is to be safe and to feel safe, right? Again, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, just yelling, shall not infringe into the void, again, is not going to accomplish anything. So, might be a little bit better to say, okay, well, here is the evidence that the gun data that you have is false, right? I mean, the stuff that you're basing your opinion on is not correct, but we can agree that we want people to be safe. It is, and I think it's useful for a conservative person or libertarian or whatever however you refer to yourself, to acknowledge some basic realities. Like there is probably, I would say most people know someone who should not have access to a gun, some crazy asshole, right? That just shouldn't. Then the second part of that question becomes, okay, so who adjudicates that? If you leave it to the government, then the government will weaponize that against the people. They'll call you crazy. I mean, this is what they do, right? It's classification followed by indictment. And I would, again, point to this long history required, like violent history, to acquire these or codify into law these natural rights that we have to self-defense and stuff like that, and point out that the biggest threat to our safety is not an individual lunatic with a gun. Rather, it is the government disarming people. And you can see that in China and in Russia and in Germany in the 30s and so on and so forth. It's happened over and over again throughout human history. But you have to know that human history and be able to articulate it to have that conversation. And then you have to have a solution to the problem, right? It's like, okay, cool. Right now, in the United States, at least, I don't know about the rest of Western countries, but in the United States, the average 21-year-old male has the same level of testosterone that their grandfather did in 2000. It's about a 40% decrease in the last generation and a half.
Right.
Which is, not to be crude or anything, but if you've ever been around your girlfriend or wife or some other woman when she's during PMS and her hormones are all out of imbalance, it can make you crazy as fuck. As a matter of fact, one of the primary causes of veteran suicide is hormone imbalances. It's not post-traumatic stress. That is become a catch-all for a lot of stuff that's going on physiologically with people's bodies. It's like, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on, to include nihilism in young men. You know what I mean? Purposelessness, people that have been told that they're bad because they're dudes, and they're looking for some kind of purpose, and they're looking for some kind of pat on the back from society, right? Like all the stuff that you go through is worthwhile. and it matters to us. Same thing that veterans have gone through the last 25 years. And without that stuff, people tend to trend towards nihilism, and it happens all over the world, all throughout human history. We see people who are in impoverished countries with no job who get radicalized by Islam and become terrorists. We see black and brown kids in inner cities who feel like they have no opportunity, the government hates them, and blah, blah, whatever, and they turn to gang violence, right? And we see white kids become mass shooters, and it's all nihilism, right? It's a symptom of the same disease. It's like, okay, we can deal with these problems, right? We can deal with these problems. And then you have to make the point again that, if one person is crazy, like how many people have to be crazy before we start taking people's rights away? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, because what ends up happening is like we're having a philosophical discussion in principle versus in practice, right? Did you see the clip that was going viral the last couple of days between Obama and Alan Keyes back in the like state Senate race in Illinois from obviously a couple decades ago now at this point? It wasn't about the Second Amendment. It was about marriage and marriage equality and all of that, which we don't have to get into. I don't want to, but Alan Keyes was talking about the difference between in principle and in practice, right? Like in principle, like you're talking about the Second Amendment. So just because there are some people that shouldn't have guns doesn't mean that in principle, every citizen shouldn't have guns. It means that we should have a set of frameworks in place that as citizens who have the Second Amendment, we understand that some people can't have those guns. So that's a fair discussion to have about who should have access, when they should have access, why they should or shouldn't have access. That's a reasonable discussion to have. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say because some people, gang members in the inner city and white kids in the suburbs who are nihilists, commit mass shootings, then therefore nobody should have guns. But that argument gets sent to the bottom of the barrel really, really fast, and therefore we're not able to actually have a productive discussion, again, in this case, about the Second Amendment.
Yeah. I mean, look, denying reality doesn't help you. And I think that's one of the problems with hyperpartisanship. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. It forces you into a position where you have to defend the indefensible, whether it's a stupid idea or a bad politician. And look, right. Just to be clear, I'm glad Trump won because he's clearly better than the retarded people who were running against him. But rooting for a politician is like cheering for the umpire. We don't do that shit here. This is America, God damn it. You know what I mean? Like we do not do that. That is, you should treat politicians the same way you treat the umpire at a baseball game. You like or dislike them based on their performance. That's how it should work. Not because of the letter at the end of their name, not because of the cut of their jib, not because you want to have a fucking beer with them. No. Whether or not they support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to include their peers, right? That's why you should care about somebody's opinion. Yeah, but you can't get there. Again, to your point, you can't get there unless you're willing to admit the truths that the other person is saying and acknowledge the fact that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. Because, I mean, we saw it in this last election, pretending that the left continuously telling people that the economy was actually good, that groceries aren't that bad, that foreign policy is going pretty well, blah, 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 all this bullshit that Biden was sharp as a tack. All these lies mounted up are tallied up over time. And people are like, okay, you're all full of shit, right? Now that happens at the macro level, but it happens at a micro level as well. If somebody that tells me that everybody should have unabated access to all firearms regardless of anything, right? That's not a serious person. To me, that's not a serious person. But somebody who says, unless there's here's the qualifier that I would use, unless there's some specific reason not to, right? And when I say specific reason, I mean a danger to other people. I wouldn't even say yourself, frankly, because to me, a crime requires a victim, and the victim can't be yourself, and it cannot be the state. It can't be the government. It has to be another human being, right? That's a real crime. Unless there is evidence, like hard evidence, that you intend to commit some crime against somebody or that you are mentally deficient, then I do think you should have access to any kind of weapon. If you can afford a fucking rocket launcher, then good for you, buddy. You know what I mean? Because people that can't, people cannot afford shit like that. Nobody's going to go out and buy a fucking a 50 cal sniper rifle because it costs $15,000, right? It's just retarded, right? Nobody's buying fighter jets because they cost millions of dollars. So the market has already decided who can and cannot own those weapons. There's no reason for the government to get involved in that shit. But again, from the conservative side, to say that even basic handgun ownership should apply to everybody regardless of their mental faculties, like, okay, maybe we need to have a discussion about that, because that doesn't sound right to me. If it was my neighborhood and there was one dipshit driving his car around like an asshole, I would go stop him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you should think about that as well. But that's the problem, right? I think that it is just, to some degree, I think it's mental laziness, or maybe we're just busy. But to have the rights unabated requires effort on the part of the individual citizen, right? Because if you don't want the government in charge of that stuff, then collectively we have to be in charge of it. You understand? Like when the government shows up to some place, some city, some small town somewhere, and nobody has their hand out asking for money or asking for help, then they have no power there. That is your job as a citizen, to make sure that your neighbors are taken care of, to make sure that to what degree you're able, you enforce standards, not laws, but standards, right? Like, this is the expectation for my area. And if you've got a problem with that, you're going to have to deal with me. I'm not saying go be a fucking vigilante or anything. I'm just saying, if you live that life, people will adjust to it. That's what leadership is. You have to have the courage to do that shit. And if you don't, then just understand that if you leave gaps in coverage, the government will fill them. They'll fill them, and they'll steal your money to do it, and they'll never give the power back. That's what the show Citizen I Do is all about. The definition of a citizen, and what I think America is the idea that individual liberty and personal entrepreneurship are the ultimate inoculation to tyrannical bullshit. You have to be ever vigilant. That's why Ben Franklin said a republic if you can keep it, right? That's what he meant by that. And I think it's also what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. I don't think he wanted us in a constant cycle of warfare. I think he meant blood, sweat, and tears. If you want to live in this free country, you better work your ass off to make it free. Because if you leave it up to these dumbasses in DC, it's not going to be like that.
That's right. So at a tactical level, as you have these conversations on Citizen Podcast, how do you approach that? How do you bring what you're discussing here strategically to life tactically as you have these conversations? How do you approach them? What is your mindset and heart set going into these conversations, either with folks you agree with or folks you might not agree with that you bring on?
Well, the first thing is, like I said, I want to understand what they're actually saying, right? Like,
Steelman. Yeah,
certainly steelman to some degree. Before you ever even consider picking something apart, you better understand the whole thing. I think that's probably the best way to introduce. Like, explain to me what you believe. Okay, explain to me why. And then I think a good way to go about that, as they're saying why, is try to ask. I mean, don't be a dick or anything, but try to ask politely about things that may have happened in their life that brought them to this conclusion. Like, what was the inflection point in your life that made you go from either not caring about this or feeling the other way to actually feeling deeply about this specific thing? Because what motivates people is almost as important, if in some cases it's more important than specifically what they believe, right? Like somebody who's been somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's been fucked over by the government a lot. A lot of people have, I guess, issues with her gun stances in the past, the fact that she was a Democrat. And then from the left side, people think that because she agrees with some of the stuff that people are, some of the complaints about the U.S. policy towards Russia and how that may have aggravated the situation, that she's some Russian assets. Like, no, like this is, she went from kind of a under the radar congressman to the DNC, where she annihilates Harris, right? And then 2 weeks later, Hillary Clinton starts calling her a Russian agent. And then Quiet Skies program from the air marshals start following her around the country and put her on a fucking terrorist watch list. And now she's in charge of, well, will be rather, in charge of national intelligence to some degree. So those apparatuses that were weaponized against her because of her political beliefs, she now has control over. Do I trust somebody like that to go in and root out corruption and limit the size and scope of government? Yeah, because she's personally affected by it. She's got an axe to grind, and I don't think that's a problem. I think it's a good thing to put somebody in that position that has an axe to grind. Do I think that some old gun beliefs are going to become relevant there? No, right? So you got to assess people like that based on their qualifications, certainly, but also based on their motivations. I think the motivations are very important. And this, we're talking about assessing the capability of somebody at the top level of government, but this happens in our day-to-day conversations as well, right? Like if you're talking, if you knew you were talking to a woman who is the victim of gun violence, right? Particularly domestic gun violence, you would probably speak differently to her, and you should, than you would your buddy, right? About that subject, because it's more personal to her, and it doesn't benefit you or your cause in any way to go after her hard. What it does benefit you to do is to be a fucking leader and show this person that, one, not everybody's like that, and two, that there are protections for somebody like her, right? Like people want to feel empowered to protect themselves. That's why gun ownership is such a great thing. I mean, some of the two fastest growing cohorts of new gun owners right now are white suburban women, and the number one is black women, right? They're the fastest growing contingent of gun owners in America because they're tired of crime and shit like that, right? That's a person you can talk to, right? They're going against decades, generations of political philosophy that their culture agreed upon, right? To protect themselves. And man, doubt is the best possible fertilizer for conversion. When you see people like that, and that's what you're looking for when you're trying to understand why somebody believes the thing they do, what happened in their life, or what piece of material they read, or whatever happened. Once you can create doubt, and you can only do it with substantive arguments. You can only do it when you say, well, here's my take, right? And here's the historical infrastructure for why I believe this, and here's some concrete examples of why. Once you create doubt, then you can talk to somebody. Then you can share an actual opinion or belief with them and have them understand it the same way you just understand it them. But you have to be the leader and start that process, frankly, because especially if you're conservative, because the left has been so propagandized the last 40 years, right? I mean, just over and over, this crazy bullshit that is demonstrably untrue that people just believe, right? And if you look, you can throw, as you said, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can just be dismissive of 48% of the country. Do you think that makes us stronger? Does it make America better? Of course not, right? So it's on you. You got to eat shit sometimes. This is the way fucking life goes.
Yeah, I mean, and that leadership that you're describing when you're having those conversations, not you, but the collective you, right? Like that's an opportunity to do what you were describing, or to not do what you were describing earlier. You're no longer talking to an avatar. You're using personal history and anecdotes to build human rapport with that person, heart to heart, mind to mind, to truly understand who they are as a person, to understand where they come from, what they believe, why they believe it. And then you're treating them like the person, the human, the citizen that they are, fellow citizen that they are, rather than just trying to own them because, they disagree with you and you're trying to convince them. Because if you just win an argument, all these debate societies and debate clubs in schools and colleges, like they have rules. Like you can win a debate and not actually win the heart or the mind of the person that you're talking to.
Yeah, that's right. So the question is, are you trying to make a difference, or are you just trying to make a fucking point? If it's the latter, then I don't want to talk to you, frankly. And I think that's the vast majority of these stupid fucking social media people on the right. That's all they're trying to do is own the libs all the time, taking shit out of context. And look, that be very aware of your role in propagating the archetype that the other side sees you as, because you're not doing anybody any fucking favors. You're certainly not doing yourself any favors by doing that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We tend to focus like too much on any given moment, too much on those like in the moment initial wins, rather than, like you're saying, try to understand, maybe try to convince, but also just mainly to try to understand so that the conversation can be fostered to get back to those shared values and shared outcomes that we're all chasing together. Sounds a little cheesy, but that's really what we're doing.
I mean, it's no different than being in a family, man. You know, people that have children, you're talking to your kid. Like if you talk to your kid like he's an idiot, then he's going to stop asking you questions. And he's going to form his own opinions about you based on third-party information, just like anybody else would. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I did it this morning. I learned something from my wife. We have a 4.5-year-old, and as I've observed her parenting and us co-parenting together, one thing that she does really, really well is remind our daughter that our daughter's a good kid. She's a good girl, and that is not completely separate from any bad behaviors that she's engaging in, but she is good, so she needs to do good, right? And like I was up early this morning with my daughter, I was reading, she was coloring, and she was getting a little squirrely. I brought her over. I said, listen, you're good. Your attitude is not good. You need to be good and do good. And she like got it. She wasn't obviously able to articulate it back to me because she's only 4.5, but like that, she understood it in a way that was like very primal. And then she was fine. People
respond to leadership at pretty much every level, whether they're a child or, an adult. It's psychology is contagious. A lot of people say that, but it's true. Anybody that's been in a gunfight knows it. Being calm, the calmer you are in a chaotic situation, the more confidence the people around you will have, and it's not a choice to be calm in chaos, right? Not really. It is mostly about experience.
Training.
Yeah. It's like, because nobody ever knows. I mean, the first time anybody gets shot at, you don't know what the fuck you're going to do. I just stood there like an idiot. Like a bullet whizzed over the top of my head at this T intersection in just outside of Sadr City. And I just like put my head down a little bit. I'm like, wait, that's stupid. I'm still like standing here. I got to get the fuck out of the way.
Yeah.
But my instinct was stupid, right? So, you gotta grow over time. But once, the goal should be to become a leader and inspire other people. I think it's not enough. Like every meaningful thing you do in your life will be in the service of other people. That's what being a man is about. It's not about you. Life's not about you. You know what I mean? And that's fine. It's like your body has been hardwired chemically to reward you when you help other people. That's just how it is, man. You can choose to do whatever the fuck you want, and that's fine. Who cares, right? This is America. You can do whatever you want. But if you want to be happy, you'll find somebody to serve. I think it was Gandhi who said, if you want to truly find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. This is something that I think warriors actually know. They just haven't been able to articulate it yet, because they felt best when they were serving other people. And then when they don't have anybody left to serve, it becomes a real problem for them.
Yeah, I think that's right. Be respectful of your time. Appreciate you joining us. We'll tag and put a bunch of stuff in the show notes. Dan, to end each episode, I ask an open-ended question. What's on your heart and your mind for our community right now? It could be a piece of advice, something you want to get off your chest, or something you want to reiterate that we've talked about today. But Dan, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
I would say that it's really important. We're in a very important time in American history right now. This is the time where we're going to choose what kind of country we're going to become out of this retarded bullshit that's been going on for the last 15 years with the gender stuff and all the pretend nonsense and the propaganda and the digitization of conversations. It's going to, now is the time. It's in this moment, what you choose to do that's going to matter down the road. Whether you choose to shrink away and become a nihilist, or whether you choose to jump in with both feet and tell circumstance and evil, fuck you. We're not pulling this bullshit anymore, right? It's going to require some effort on your part. It's not always going to be pretty, and we're going to lose some battles from time to time, but the war rages on, and it can't be won without you. So, educate yourself, make yourself stronger in whatever way you can, physically or mentally, and be a fucking leader.
Love it. Well said. Dan, appreciate you, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, sir.